Welcome to episode 4, I think, of this season. We're on chapter 3 of After Buddhism. We were just having a brief conversation about Kindle versus paper books, because I made the switch to the Kindle. And I never thought I would have wanted one, but I love the Kindle experience. Like, I love, like, it looks, first of all, I'm amazed that it looks like paper behind glass. Like, it actually looks like paper. It doesn't look like it's screen. Like, for a while I was like using the Kindle app on my iPad and going like, why would anybody want a Kindle? But the Kindle itself is like a different device. And we're sponsored by Kindle today. No, I'm just kidding. But but yeah, have you used Kindle before?
I have not. I'm I guess strictly old school regular book so far in life. But I guess the main thing I remember about Kindle, or probably the best anecdote I have, I should say, would be that my grandmother, when she was alive, this was probably like 11 years ago or more, but I remember that she used a Kindle, toward the end of her life, and she would always refer to it as Kindle, like as if that was its name. Like,
oh, like Kindle.
Could you hand me Kindle?
That's cool. I like it.
Yeah, I think
that's cool that she got into technology like that, even when she was older.
Yeah, she was a pretty cool lady. But I think you can make the font real big, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that was probably the main attraction.
Yeah, you can adjust brightness, you can make the font bigger, you can highlight, you can search. Everything's right there. I got this because I was traveling and it was a trip, and it was a longer trip, and I wanted to do a lot of reading, and I immediately was like, I can't like just pack 10 books in my bag, for a 3-week trip. Like, right. So that's why I got it. But it's true. Definitely, yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's like this little tiny thing, and yeah, I love it. So, but yeah. The downside is, and this is where our conversation started, is that I have it's hard to find quotes and things when we do things together. So I've got a screen open here to buy the paper copy of the book. All that's as lead into the chapter that I know really got me with this book, and it sounds like this is the one that got you too. And this is there's a lot to talk about in this chapter. I mean, this could have been 2 chapters in and of itself, and we may end up doing 2 parts depending on how, how much we have to say about this. But just to start, I want to read the epigraph. So this chapter is called A Fourfold Task, and there's 2 parts to this epigraph. We have from the Saka Samyutta, we have whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. And then the second part is from the same text, and it says, this is suffering, this is the arising, this is the ceasing, this is the path. In each task, there are innumerable nuances, innumerable details, innumerable implications. And that is how he introduces the fourfold task, which until I've read this book, I've never heard it put that way. I've always heard that the phrase, the 4 noble truths, which I believe is in a later chapter, but he talks a little bit about that word truth and where that came from. Spoiler alert, it may have been added later.
Yeah. This is all just good stuff already, I feel like. I was just gonna bring up something that we mentioned maybe in the last episode, which was just that, like, the way it's usually presented, I guess, is that basically all of the Buddhist teachings are just sort of elaborations on these 4 points, which, the second quote there in particular is kind of suggesting. But I don't know if he actually says this later in the chapter, or if I just came to this on my own. I think he says it later, but that first quote, just the simple, whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. It's like it could almost just all be boiled down just to that. I think he might mention that later. Like that's kind of like a one simple statement that encapsulates the entire Dharma, basically.
Yeah. Whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. Yeah. Yeah, and this is I love this framing as a task because I feel like this relates to something I said a couple episodes ago, which is something I'm still thinking about, which is just my realization that when I'm watching the clock on an unpleasant experience, that makes things take longer and hurt more. And similarly, when you're watching the clock on a pleasant experience, same thing happens, And so I love this idea of task because it's got this idea of effort. There's a thing you're doing and there's like a forward motion built in, as opposed to this idea of like nirvana and samsara. And like, I think sometimes when you frame it as nirvana and samsara, you end up with this situation of like the suffering part is the part you're just waiting to be over. And then nirvana is the part that you can relax and finally just lay in the hammock, And there's this idea that like, oh, I've got to toil and toil and toil. And then at some point I'm going to just get to this magical spot where everything's perfect, and I'm a Buddha. And I don't think that's the way it works. And I think, frankly, thinking of it that way makes it harder. Like we have to find some way in every moment to be doing things that are actively generating happiness and the causes of happiness. And frankly, waiting for whatever we're doing to be over, I don't think is one of those things.
Right. Yeah. That sort of brings us to at least one of the main ideas in this first section, which is just like that whole idea of conditioned existence and nirvana being co-present or co-emergent. That's the way I wrote it down. That's maybe a little more of like the Mahamudra terminology. I think he says something different, but it's to me like definitely the same basic point. Like, I was kind of trying to find it in here. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like,
I've got a quote from the Buddha. It's the first thing I had highlighted. I'm not sure if it's what you're talking about, but I could read it just in case.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, he says, in the Noble Quest, which scholars regard as probably the earliest account of the awakening that has come down, Gautama speaks of it as a radical shift in perspective rather than an arrival at a set of answers to existential questions. And he describes the shift as leading him to the Dharma itself. And then this is the translation of what the Gautama said. He said, "This Dharma I have reached is deep, hard to see, difficult to awaken to, quiet and excellent, not confined by thought, subtle, sensed by the wise. But people love their place." Alaya is I think the Pali or the Sanskrit. They delight and revel in their place. It is hard for people who love, delight, and revel in their place to see this ground. And the word for that is Tana. Because of this, he kind of makes that into one hyphenated word. Because of this conditionality, conditioned arising, and also hard to see this ground, the stilling of inclinations, the relinquishing of bases, the fading away of reactivity, desirelessness, ceasing, and nirvana. And then Batchelor goes on to say, the Dharma Gautama talks of reaching was thus a ground with two dimensions, one that he calls conditioned arising and another that he calls nirvana. These two dimensions are equally fundamental and primordial. Whereas conditioned arising discloses the causal unfolding of life, nirvana discloses the possibility of a life no longer determined by reactivity or habitual inclinations.
Yeah.
Does that get into what you're thinking about?
Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking of. I feel like that speaks to kind of the ongoing theme that we've been talking about, kind of like the conditioned existence and nirvana being kind of co-present or, intermingled. Uh, yeah. Um, and I guess so. The other that's related to the idea that runs through this too. The whole like place versus ground, that's an interesting translation, I guess, of Alaya, like the Alaya consciousness. He's translating as like our place, I guess, kind of like the identity that we've adopted and created.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Versus kind of the like primordial ground of being, like emptiness, I guess.
Dana.
Um,
Yeah.
I have that written down as kind of one of the most significant points of this first section, the whole place versus ground.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are so many ways where he talks about them as being similar. Like his quote from Shariputra saying, one who sees condition arising sees the Dharma, and one who sees the Dharma sees conditioned arising. And he talks about Dharma as law. And I also really like, I think another takeaway from this first part is that the pragmatism of this teaching, and really revisiting that point that like the Buddha is not interested in making a bunch of claims about metaphysics. Instead, it's he uses condition arising kind of interestingly as a way to not see the future, but like understand your past and have a good idea how to impact your future. And I think that called to mind for me just the experience of meditation or mindfulness, in the sense that like an actual like embodied all day practice of mindfulness doesn't have to be the technique of mindfulness. Like meaning like if the technique is to stay purposeful in the present moment without any judgment, like that's not sustainable for all day long. We can't get anything done like that, and we need a little bit of reactivity, and we need a little bit of past and future thinking, and we need a little bit of judging, but there's an imbalance towards the reactivity and the past and future and the judging. So I like this idea of thinking about conditioned arising as the means, like the skillful way to think about past and future. Like if we're going to think about that, we could, on the one hand, think of it with a lot of what was the Tibetan word that he used for attachment? Like the getting hooked. Reactivity, kind of. We could do it with a lot of reactivity. We could do it with a lot of like, wishing we could be in a place we aren't anymore, or cling to some idea of what we think things should be in the future. But I think the idea is like we can, with a real awareness and a practice, use condition arising as the most effective method of examining our past to understand why we are where we are today, because we can understand our circumstances today through looking at our past habits and thoughts and actions. And similarly, we can, if we want to affect a certain kind of future, we need to think right now about what we're thinking and doing, and saying, in order to make that future come as close as possible as we can to what we want. I mean, obviously we don't get to pick, but we can shape things a little bit, and we can, if nothing else, make ourselves better prepared for whatever's coming next.
Overall, what he's doing in the first section is just kind of giving the basic working base view of reality according to Dharma. I mean, would you say that that's true? This is kind of like what I guess the subsequent discussion of the 4 tasks is kind of like based on.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's like laying the groundwork here, and also like with these analogies of like these he quotes apart from the Dhammapada that says, just as a farmer irrigates a field, an arrowsmith fashions an arrow, and a carpenter shapes a piece of wood, so the sage tames his self. And again, like the idea of action or skill or motion as being the Dharma, not some sort of fixation on a finalized, perfected state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's actually like a quote in here that I could read that maybe just highlights that a little more. So it's toward the end, it's on my page 60, but it begins with so nirvana can be compared to the sudden opening up of a space within one's experience when one's innate inclinations die down and reactivity fades away. One glimpses in such moments how one is free to act in a way that is not determined by reactivity, thereby enabling the use of practical reason to decide on another kind of future. But these moments of nirvanic emptiness are liable to vanish just as abruptly as they appear. So, I mean, that kind of says it all pretty explicitly. And then, like on the next page, he's kind of talking about, I guess, this idea of like our place, the way that we construct our place, such as race, gender, ethnicity, culture, nationality, the city you're from, your job, your religion, or whatever, like all the things that make up our personality that we identify with, which I guess is kind of like those are, to me, like maybe the most practical way to illustrate this twofold ground is just kind of to think about how we construct our sense of self on those kind of very basic factors, and then to kind of consider that, like, the other side of it is the ground or the emptiness aspect, just sort of like the gaps in that, and also speaks to how there's that dimension of our being that can never really be defined by any of that stuff.
Yeah. And I think that idea of like thinking of places as being roles or parts we play as in different situations, contexts, also shows like the inevitable conflict that those things create. I mean, I think a lot of times like who we are in one context may seem to like contradict who we are in another context, or we feel like some sort of like inertia of one context coming into another context. I mean, the one I'm thinking of just from personal experience is like the trying to stop working or thinking about work at the end of the day kind of thing, like as I'm invested in the work, and then I go to sit down on the couch and I'm still coming up with ideas and thinking about stuff and wanting to write it down. And that's just another one. But yeah, what I like though, like I think another quote I highlighted here about that I think gets at that is where he, Batchelor says, when a wanderer called Sivaka asked what it meant for the Dharma to be clearly visible, Gautama responded by posing another question. And I bring this up because I feel like this is another one of those permission granting kind of things that I'm grateful to hear, and he says, Gautama says, what do you think, Sivaka? When there is greed within you, do you know there's greed within me? And when there's no greed within you, do you know there's no greed within me? And he answers, yes. And Gautama says, with hatred, confusion, and those qualities of mind associated with greed, hatred, and confusion, when they are within you, do you know they are present? And when they are not within you, do you know they are absent? And the response is yes. And Gautama says, it is in this way, Sivaka, that the Dharma is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting, to be personally sensed by the wise. And I would tie that back to the idea of like past and future being a part of a practice of Dharma, and react, being able to react, being a part of a complete practice of the Dharma, and being able to be discerning as being a part. It's not like we're trying to take everything to the point of being some sort of crystallized version of the technique of, never judging or never thinking about past or future. Like we can be aware of the moment where we are experiencing greed and still be present in that moment. And that's actually the functioning of a mind that's aware and present, similarly with confusion or anger. I think that's something I've definitely noticed over the, many years now of practicing, is like, I definitely notice even like later states of anger, or like annoyance that I might not have before. And I'm also much more aware of my tendency of like thinking I need a thing or I need a situation to be a certain way. Even if it's like kind of not that intense, I can become more aware of that greed kicking in. And yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's, and I mean, I relate to that as well. And also just maybe like a little bit more of a, ability to just allow those states of mind to just be there as they are. Like, cause that's kind of the thing to me, is like when that stuff comes up, it's almost like we want to act on it as some attempt to get rid of it, as if that will, like, get rid of the discomfort or the frustration involved with experiencing strong emotional sensation, when really it's not, doesn't really work like that. But the ability to kind of just be there, recognize what's coming up, and let it be there is I think some result of getting in the habit of practicing mindfulness and awareness over some amount of time. I feel like overall something worth mentioning in this first section is just like, this is like, to me, pretty profound Dharma teaching. Like, the whole, taking the ability to rest in emptiness here and there as the main method is like pretty deep practice. I mean, it's considered kind of advanced from some points of view. I know something that I kind of wrote down here. Again, I don't know if he says this or if I just said it, but anyway, so like to look into that ground of like selflessness can be kind of unsettling in a way. Like I think he mentions that in here, how to kind of have that glimpse of seeing through all of those identifications that we have, I am this, I am that, can be like a little unsettling. But I just think it's also important to keep in mind that it's also potentially very liberating, right? And I think the key is to just be able to kind of see both of those reactions, because if we feel that kind of like ungrounded sense of like, oh my God, if I'm not all this stuff, then maybe I'm not anything. If that scares us away right away, we're really robbing ourselves of the ability to go deeper into that and recognize the liberating quality of it. And then by the same token, I kind of feel like the if we just kind of have the idea that it's just this amazing, beautiful, liberating thing, that can sometimes actually also rob the depth of the experience a little bit, because it's easy to kind of like feel good about it and get excited about that insight, but that kind of brings you out of it, because I feel like it should be a little unsettling. Like the unsettling, like when we become unsettled, that means you're actually getting the insight. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, that's kind of like the reverberation of it. It's like, whoa,
Yeah. And if I think of settled, for me, if I'm settled, I don't want to get up and do something. So like, it's probably good to be a little unsettled, like that means we're ready
right
to respond, Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, that's just it's good stuff. I was actually this is kind of random, but I decided that I would mention it if I thought of it, because it was just,
Yeah.
it's this book this book I have been reading. So the author is Jim Harrison. He's an amazing, right? He's no longer alive, but you know, he wrote poetry and fiction and nonfiction. And so I was reading his collection of novellas. It's three short, no, like basically like a short novel. You know, they're about roughly 100 pages each.
Mm-hmm.
And the collection is called Legends of the Fall, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the name of the third one, and that's probably one of his most famous books. It actually became a movie with Brad Pitt in it. But anyway, so the second one in this collection is called The Man Who Gave Up His Name.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just really funny because when we were reading this chapter and kind of thinking about all this stuff, I was reading this one and it just like struck me as really interesting because basically what happens in this book is it's a guy who he's in his 40s and he has maybe kind of something like a midlife crisis where like he gets divorced and then his dad dies. This doesn't really spoil it, but anyway, so through a couple of significant events, you know, he sort of spontaneously finds himself having these insights. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like I feel like it's like classic Pema Chodron almost a little bit. Like, you know, it's like when things fall apart, but it's like
Yeah.
it's got a very humorous quality to it. And Jim Harrison studied Zen Buddhism to some extent, so he wouldn't have
Mm.
been unaware of this kind of experience. But it's a delightful little read actually because it's this guy who basically starts to, you know, he kind of has like this kind of like an awakening experience, but he doesn't really know what to call it. He just starts living in this
Mm.
totally different way, and it's really funny and kind of cool. But I think that's where the title comes from, The Man Who Gave Up His Name or something. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
kind of
It's like
what we're
giving up
talking
place.
about.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
It was a cool little convergence of things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've heard of the book you met, the Legends of the Fall. Is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So
Awesome.
it's in that book if anyone ever wanted to read it. It's good stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the one note I had that I think relates to that too is this idea that Nirvana is not like the exclusive property of fully realized Buddhist
Mm-hmm.
meditators.
Right.
But the
Yeah.
idea is that it's present for all of us on a ground as the ground on which we all live in this world right now. Like it's kind of like that. It's thinking spatially about place and ground. Like, you know, there's different places, but if you think of like Earth as being the ground, like we're all on that ground, you know, and you can go to one place and be a certain person and go to another place and be another person, but that ground is in common, you know. And so
Hmm.
whether you notice you're on that ground or not, or recognize that that is the same ground as every other being on the
Mm.
planet, is another story. But yeah, I think that's an especially important point, because I have always kind of felt like it's important to, if something is just a natural law or the way things are, it shouldn't be the case that only people who follow a certain religion can find it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So another quote, I had two more quotes for this section, which is there's one here that says, "Whatever comfort and security may be gained by identifying with a place are achieved at the cost of alienating oneself from ground. A place is seductive because it provides relative permanence and reliability in an impermanent and unreliable world. My sense of having a place reassures me about who I am, which is constantly affirmed by the ongoing monologue in my head and by the way others address and treat me. Only when one's place is threatened by the failure of a marriage, the loss of a job, the occupation of one's homeland, a crisis of faith, the breaking down of one's health, a psychological collapse, only then does one realize how fragile and tentative it is. At such moments, one may be overwhelmed by a glimpse into the fascinating and terrifying abyss of one's ground."
Yeah. I think that was what led to some of my notes, that little
Yes.
part.
And then the last one I had here too is like place and ground are not separate states, but two different ways of configuring the same life. I can configure myself as a person assured of his identity and place, who unhesitatingly follows the bidding of his habitual reactions. Or I can configure myself as a person balanced on a shifting, changing ground, who aspires to respond to the unique demands of each situation, unconditioned by reactivity. The challenge of practicing the Dharma is to discover how to establish the optimal conditions under which a human life can flourish from its ground. And that's how part 1 ends. And yeah, so I my last note on this part was just that I feel like the 4 tasks here are a method of connecting with the ground. You know, it's not that it erases the place, but we are so often wrapped with our place that we need to, what we need more actively do is connect with the ground. And this is a method for that.
Yeah, definitely.
And then we get to part 2. And this has some really cool analogies in it. In particular, we start out talking about how Gautama describes the shift from place to ground as like being going against the stream. So we talked in an earlier chapter of the stream of reactivity and the stream of the Eightfold Path kind of meeting, or maybe that was this chapter. But he talks about going against the stream here as going against the cumulative force of our reactivity, which is symbolized in a lot of these discourses as the armies of Mara, the Lord of Death. So the idea that like Mara personifies our reactivity and our clinging and these kinds of things. And one thing that really stood out for me about this section was it's kind of a quick section here, but Stephen Batchelor describes our reactivity as being our evolutionary inheritance. And I think this is really important because this comes up a lot, especially in works about trauma and stuff. This idea that like there's an analogy, I can't remember who used this one, if it was Peter Levine or somebody else, but there's an analogy about thinking about like the tiger in the bushes, in the sense that like we developed a vigilance as a species so that we would be awake and aware if there was like a tiger in the bushes that was going to jump out and hurt us. We want to be able to hear it, spot it, be aware, and be able to react quickly if it happens. And this is how our neurobiology evolved. And if evolution happens over a long span of time, and we're still carrying around that neurobiology, but now the tiger may be an email from our boss, and we're reacting like our life is in danger. Like our it's not even. I mean, there's some of this is nurture rather than nature, but a lot of the nature part is it's just wired in. This kind of worry and even the physical response of those kind of things, and a lot of the reasons why we have a hard time in this modern age is like we're really at the very beginning of this whole new way of interacting, and this sort of caveman neurobiology is being triggered all the time by little things, and in fact being manipulated by companies and marketing and all kinds of stuff, and political candidates, like they're leveraging this that neurobiology of fear to make us do things or act certain ways or buy things or not do things. And I like that he brought that up, because I think that's an important point. Number one, because we should just be aware of it if we want to be able to have some compassion for ourselves. But number two, like we need to recognize that like the initial arisal of reactivity or fear, or the 3 things we talk a lot about here: greed, hatred, and confusion. A lot of that is hardwired, gets in there. It's not just going to go away. Like, so we can't pretend like there's going to be some point where that's just in our lifetime, where that's just gone,
Yeah, for sure. He kind of makes that point a few times, like, as long as we're in one of these bodies, those are going to be things that we deal with. So is he, in here, he says, greed, hatred, and confusion. Do you take that to be like what we might more typically call like desire, anger, and ignorance, like the main three poisons?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. That's what I thought too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing I guess is just that all of that sort of speaks to like any kind of freedom that we're able to gain as being like a continual process of being actively present with experience and aware and kind of like dropping into relating to things more from the ground, uh, rather than that we're somehow on like a long journey and eventually we get to a place where it's sort of over, you know?
Mm-hmm. Place. Yeah.
Right. That's an
Buddhahood
interesting.
is a place too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Good point there. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think that the part that really stuck out to me here too is where he talks about this idea that like there are threads of the discourses that seem to make the point that we're just going to uproot these tendencies entirely.
Right.
And I think the point is modern science shows that this is probably not going to happen. I think at best, what's going to happen is we will see these things arise and not be beholden to our reactivity about them. And the analogy he used is, he says, so there's a short text in the Sutta Nipata that portrays Gautama addressing his mythical nemesis Mara with a statement of resolve. And Gautama says, that army of yours, which the world together with the gods cannot overcome, I shall destroy with understanding, as if smashing an unfired pot with a pebble. Having brought my thoughts under control and established mindfulness, I shall wander from country to country, training many followers. And Batchelor's commentary on this says, this passage acknowledges that Mara's army cannot be defeated by conventional or even divine powers. The Buddha is fully aware that these forces cannot be excised by performing a kind of spiritual lobotomy. The key to overcoming Mara lies in the use of one's intelligence, the ability one has to change how one thinks and imagines. If we represent Mara's forces as an invading army, then we are liable to see ourselves as vulnerable and defenseless. But if we imagine them as unfired pots, we picture ourselves in a different way. Instead of being cowering wimps, we could be transformed into people with a well-honed skill in throwing stones. The psychology that underpins this metaphor goes to the heart of Gautama's vision of human capability. By learning how to stabilize attention and dwell in a lucid space of non-reactive awareness, we gain the freedom to see the forces of Mara as thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, and stories that naturally arise because of the impact of the environment on the senses of a conscious creature. From that perspective, we see a cascading array of transient, impersonal events that, provided we do not energize them by identifying with them, will fade away as soon as their charge is exhausted. They are not overcome by destruction. Rather, we must understand how they arise and play themselves out. The Dharma, therefore, involves bringing one's wayward thoughts under control, establishing mindfulness and concentration, and then setting out to realize one's goals in the world. And he goes on to say, related to that, we acquire freedom from reactivity, yet without the reactivity ceasing to occur. That's maybe a concise way to say all of that. We get freedom from it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and the example used for that is like the discourses are filled with stories of the Buddha dealing with Mara. And Mara's still showing up, and Mara's still trying to tempt him and convince him of other stuff. And so even after his awakening, the Buddha is dealing with these things.
Yeah, it sort of, to me, like also brings up just, the whole notion that actually sometimes the arising of like thoughts and emotions or whatever can basically be a more profound means for liberation than if they don't, like in order to really have freedom, it's like we actually, the best way to gain freedom is to be looking at the reactivity and recognizing, the underlying awareness aspect. Like if you're in meditation or something, say we're practicing shamatha, right? And basically we're like relatively free of thought. That's basically in the long run less profound than if we're kind of in a stable state and are able to see a thought rise and fall, right? That's like, whoa, okay. Now I see something about the real nature of that thought rather than just dwelling in peace or whatever. It's a little bit more of an impactful experience.
Yeah, and I'm seeing in my head too, like it's sort of like a metaphor about like trying to decorate one's place. And what I mean is like, I think if we have some fixed idea about what calm or peace we think should look like in our life, then we may start to not only cling to place, but kind of try to mold it and decorate it to look more like what we think it should, like we would do with our house or our apartment, like we kind of, so, and I think the effect of that is a lot of times tuning out of mindfulness and awareness and instead like kind of papering over it with concepts. And that means maybe when we have some reactivity, we have some greed, hatred, or confusion, we try to somehow maybe replace that with something, some sort of idea about peace or battle it, try to destroy it, get rid of it.
Right.
With some kind of maybe breath work practice, and I think that's a whole other topic, but like, yes, there are times where we need to do some sort of breathing to calm ourselves down. But I would argue that a lot of those times we're just reacting to a state that we don't think we should feel. And then in that way, when we react to it and try to get rid of it, I think this comes up in the next part too. We end up just reinforcing the reactivity, and we end up reinforcing the suffering. So yeah, there's definitely like a very strong message in here to feel all your feels, Yeah.
It's funny because like just, the impulse to respond with a method is like totally just investing in the reality of the perception, rather than just, it's like we're basically like showing how seriously we take it.
Yeah.
by feeling like, oh, I've got to do something about this,
Yes.
Like, oh well, just let it go.
We're causing it to like extra co-arise, like
yeah.
So yeah, the last kind of point here is he says that he talks about how basically that stream of the Eightfold Path encountering the stream of reactivity creates turbulence. Like that's how it feels. And I think that's a lot of times what I end up saying to people in working in meditation coaching is just recognizing like, yeah, if you're doing it right, it's going to feel like a little bit of work. It's going to, it may not feel like the easiest thing. And I mean, I think the easiest way to think of that is it's just if there's a flow, and if it's easy to kind of just go with that flow, a lot of times what Dharma is doing is try to go the opposite direction. And that means there's some effort and there's some resistance and that's how it should feel, but at the same time, we need to know, when we're outside of a reasonable window of tolerance to do that kind of a practice. But But yeah, I like the idea, the way that part 2 closes is saying that the result of that meeting of the Eightfold Path and reactivity is turbulence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's looking to me like with the time, like we should talk about section 3 and then take a short break, and then we can do the rest of the chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, part 3 to me, I think is in many ways it starts to frame up the fourfold task. But the main notes I had here were about addressing the story of the Buddha's first moments after awakening, and like whether he was inclined to inaction or inclined to teaching. And
Right.
I thought that was fascinating because I think I'd always heard the story that like he had this experience of awakening and was like, how am I ever going to tell anybody this? Like, maybe I just won't teach. And then he was quiet in the woods for 2 weeks until Indra or some god came down and asked him, please give this teaching. Everybody needs it. But he points out that there's another divergent account where that we quoted a couple episodes back, which is when he said, I'm going to teach this, and we're going to have this fourfold group of men and women, mendicants and adherents, and we're going to spread this. And but what became more prominent was the story in the Noble Quest, which was this Brahmanized kind of version where I think because the assumption here, I think, is that after the time of the Buddha, the power of the Brahmanic religion grew. And then at that time, if they wanted the Dharma to last, it had to get some sort of stamp of approval from.
Right.
So that's why there's this story of like the gods came, these Brahmanic gods came and asked him to teach. And then, of course, now it's approved by God. So now this is valid teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that seems pretty believable, honestly. It's kind of funny. I mean, I definitely thought about this point a lot because, there's certain things about the way I interpreted the traditional story that I really liked. Like the fact that the Buddha didn't teach until he was asked to teach. I always had a lot of confidence in that because it was like, okay, yeah, he didn't feel like he had to go like tell everybody about this. It was just that he was requested to teach. That's always been kind of dear to me,
I like that too. Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I feel like what he presents is kind of like a plausible sequence of events. On the other hand, I guess another way to look at it might just be that like, it's like kind of like we're saying, like simply a request to teach, maybe by a being who had perception beyond that of ordinary human beings. And then we get into the question of like, are there such beings out there? I mean, the thing to me is like, it definitely makes sense to talk about the Dharma on this kind of like uber practical, reasonable level that he presents here. Like, I think that is the most reasonable approach for us generally. But then on the other hand, part of me is kind of like, okay, but like in the grand scheme of things, in a sort of vast and largely mysterious universe, like, are we going to really like throw out the idea that there may be non-human classes of beings? Like, I mean, it's like the idea of alternate dimensions of reality and the fact that there may be other modes of existence other than human life. I mean, I can't totally say that I can just dismiss all that.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, it's like, okay, well, it is kind of conceivable on some level that like at that time, maybe a what we would call a god requested the Buddha to teach. But then again, obviously, you could kind of see that what he's presenting could very well be true as well. So who knows?
Mm-hmm.
It's the conclusion.
And if it really is that he's sticking with a middle way approach, even in this rethinking the Dharma for a secular age, then maybe it's just good to know that, like, oh yeah, there could also be like a very human reason to add that part to the story.
Right.
Just so it's part of the narrative, it could be, and then I think, like the buffet kind of view of the Dharma, if someone wants to, a big plate of deities and mystery, they can have that, but if you're leaning more towards the pragmatic secular, then that option is there too, and there isn't a definitive answer,
Right. And I mean, it could be kind of like both things could be true at the same time, but I would say, just like for me, aside from all the speculation about other classes of beings and whatnot, I just had such great kind of like confidence about the point that the Buddha never took it upon himself to teach until there was kind of like something coming from the outside, so to speak, because I don't know, I think it's actually like kind of a really profound teaching in terms of how the phenomenal world takes place, I guess. That's how I always, it's like we sort of conduct ourselves partially based on what's appropriate and like what comes to us, and just that whole relationship struck me as being a good point of consideration, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know if you had this at Millsap, but like I was thinking about when I went to college, and how there were a couple people who would just come and stand in front of the campus center and preach, and they weren't invited. And they said a lot of things that were not nice about a lot of people, including my friends and, and maybe even myself. And, they would just come and do that. And hey, it's America. So, free speech is great. But I'm thinking of this now because it is kind of like that. Like if you're gonna, if someone asks you to teach, there's definitely a receptivity, and of course more likelihood that it's going to impact you in a positive way. And so, yeah, I agree. I always like that part of the story too. I think it's kind of in a way an echo of the moment in my mind where the Buddha broke his ascetic vows when the girl brought him a bowl of porridge, like she offered him that and then he took it, he accepted it, and so
exactly. Yeah.
It's like a positive impact of the external world or a harmonious kind of thing. And I think related to that too, like I love the story about the first person he met, Upaka, I think is the name here. It says, shortly after setting off for Benares, Gautama encountered a wanderer called Upaka of the fatalist Ajivaka school. Your faculties are clear, remarked Upaka. Your skin is pure and bright. Who is your teacher? Whose dharma do you profess? In reply, Gautama declared in a series of bombastic verses that he had no teacher or counterpart and that no one understood things the way he did. Upaka responded, "May it be so, friend." Then shaking his head, he took a bypath and departed. And it says the episode fails to present Gautama in a wholly positive light, and some of the phrasing is in an archaic form of Pali, which together suggests that such a meeting could have taken place. With its ironic tone, the story mocks charismatic authority. Gautama is left chastened. He had impressed Upaka with his presence, but had singly failed to impress him with his words. On opening his mouth, he must have sounded like any guru of his or our time. Gurus tend to be charismatic individuals whose claim to enlightenment rests merely on their own or their followers say so. I love that, like, just through like walking and being there, Upaka was like, oh, look at this person. Like they seem like
Yeah,
they know
yeah.
something. And then he opens his mouth and he's about how great he is. I mean, I know he wasn't doing it selfishly, but it's like there's some skill involved in teaching, and the timing is important. And yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, that is interesting.
And that dovetails into the story about, I mean, this is part of the reason why I love this book is he goes into these little nuggets about like this 300-mile detour. You know, he was headed to Benares, but he decided to go the totally opposite direction in the
Right.
hottest time of the year when he'd just been sick. And why did he do that? Well, the texts say because he had the divine eye, you know, like the divine eye led him there. And like, again, like, sure, there's definitely like a place for that kind of thinking, but to a modern secular reader, that can be off-putting a little bit, you know, like,
Yeah.
that's the reason we have to trust, you know?
Right, right, right.
I don't have a lot more for this chapter. I just had the summary of the 4 tasks.
Same here, actually. Yeah. I'm just kind of looking over the notes. I don't really have anything else. Although I did just see where he does mention that verse, that single line verse from the very beginning. It, whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. He does kind of come back and say that that's like a short, essentialized, like core meaning of Gautama's vision.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think he says how that was probably like the seed of the 4 tasks, which he posits were actually worked out over a long time. So we get it as like the first teaching of the Buddha, but I think what he's implying is that the teaching at the time might have been whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. And over time, it was worked into this more, this 4-fold task. And the way he introduces that is he says, the task is to comprehend suffering, let go of the arising, behold the ceasing, and cultivate the path. Or as Batchelor puts it in more modern language, embrace suffering, let go of what arises, see it ceasing, and act.
Yeah. Actually, you said embrace suffering, but he says actually embrace life.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you for that.
That's his.
Embrace life, let go of what arises.
I mean, I just appreciate that little distinction because actually, I feel like that's a way in which that kind of rephrasing is a way in which we as Dharma followers could talk about this in a little bit more of a relatable, palatable way with people, you know, like the whole truth of stuff. I mean, it is the case that like Buddhism has kind of a bad rap for that whole first noble truth, the way that it's presented, because the way it's presented is like not quite right, honestly. Like it just, like to just say that life is suffering. I mean, it's just not, that's not a complete statement about how things are, It
feels misleading like, if somebody just tells you need to believe that. It's like, but I know I enjoy things. So it can't.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And then, it's like, it's too convoluted to try to explain how the fact that even in our enjoyment, it still has the seed, it's like, okay. Like maybe we could just think of a better way to say that from the beginning.
Because life contains all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't really plan to, but I had a new person come on Sunday to the meditation group I have here. And sometimes, or most of the time when a new person comes, we kind of end up getting into just like a pretty like informal, but sometimes far reaching discussion of Buddhism. Like, just the intro to meditation kind of just comes together with the fact that usually people that show up for the first time actually do have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And they want to kind of know, they want to know about what all this stuff is all about, and so I don't really have a set time frame for the Sunday afternoon meditation. Usually it's just an hour, but sometimes if a new person comes, I'll just let it keep going. And anyway, I ended up drawing on what I remembered from this chapter to kind of talk about some stuff, and it really landed. I mean, it seemed to be like for myself as well, it felt like finally a way to talk about this that actually made sense to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I was kind of I was doing it from memory. So like, it wasn't like I was presenting it just the way he does, but I feel like it is just a really useful perspective that he puts forth here.
Yeah. Yeah. And thanks for that clarification, because I actually was taking these notes while I was on the treadmill at the gym. And I think I probably listened to it go past and just kind of typed in real quick, embrace suffering. But yeah, it's a super important distinction about his approach. Yeah. So I'll see him one more time, and then we'll take a short break. And for our listeners, we'll see you again next week. But so that the 4 tasks here: embrace life, let go of what arises, see it ceasing, and act. All right. We'll see you next week. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.